right, how's everybody doing? Good? Alive and kicking, I hope. So, thank you for coming out. It's kind of a muggy day in Vancouver today, but that is always a good time to get inside and start to think about some stuff. So I'm going to dive right in. So the topic that I've chosen for tonight is definitely closely related to the things that those are in 586 are working on. However, I think they apply to a lot of different things out there, and therefore, if there's others that are not in that class who are listening in or will be listening in, I think it will be a valuable use of your time, even if you aren't doing that. So the topic is ways of knowing, from theory to practice to theory. Now, I specifically wanted to kind of chart a trajectory um, from theoretical kind of position, like asking fundamental questions about like what is this all about, to um, to practice, and then back to theory, meaning what are the ideas, how do you apply them, and when you apply them, what potentially can you learn as a result of that? That's essentially what I mean with that. All right, and now starting with ways of knowing, I'm going to get into that, but what do you think that I mean when I say ways of knowing? What's that? What's the main kind of thrust behind that? Anybody? TEK. It's like one example. Right. One word that some is used a lot to describe that is TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. Right. What's another word or another type of way of knowing that people use a lot? Yeah, local knowledge is the other big one that's used a lot, at least in our area of work. Um, Media could be, I mean, mythology you could even consider to be social media way of knowing. I don't know, in an abstract way, perhaps, yeah. That's more of a tool. But I mean, yeah, you could say that. Like if you were to talk to a bunch of YouTubers, like if you went to a YouTube conference and started talking to everybody who was there, I mean, they'd certainly have a way of knowing about the world, correct? They would have their own worldview. They'd have certain terminology that's unique to that kind of cultural group. So you could say that, there's a way of knowing that's fixated around the use of social media. So yeah. So I guess the first question I have is, why is this important to know about in practice? So why do we need to really know about this? Um, and there's a lot of reasons why, but one of the realities um, that we're confronted with now, I think perhaps, I hope where there's no baseline. Yep. And also, not only that, there are some things that the dominant paradigm in our line of work and in environmental science and environmental applications is Western science, traditional Western science, if you will, which is one worldview. It's one way of knowing. Now, it's a powerful one, that's and successful one. So science, as we know it, is a successful way of knowing. So why would you say science is successful? What's been successful about the way of knowing we know of science, natural science, Western science? Why does it why is it so dominant? Breaks. Yeah, not only does it does that successfully, like if you look that has what emerged from hypothesis-driven science and kind of the framework and knowledge that's associated with Western science: data, proof, uh, a language that has logical structure that's reproducible and universal, successfully universal, uh, and has produced significant results for us, technologically speaking, medically speaking, from an engineering standpoint. There's a lot that this is why I'm very cautious about bashing science. It's easy for us these days to bash science and say, we need to adopt completely personal science. Well, what, the world around us is systematically repeatable, peer reviewed even. Yeah, I mean peer reviewed, but repeatable. I like that. Repeatable. There's repeatable results that are predictable, right? That is a function of the way that we have structured that way of knowing, the characteristics of it. Okay. So it's a powerful way of knowing, and an effective and useful and beneficial way of knowing. However, there are other legitimate forms there are other forms of legitimate and relevant knowledge. It can also be biased. Yes. Science can also be biased according to who's controlling the project. Yes, exactly. And science can be used in certain ways, which I will exemplify, for purposes that are um, science can be used in ways that are political in nature, manipulative, in a bunch of different ways. Okay. So, and I mean, we can that, but I'm gonna give you references to this and argue that, we're at a certain stage right now because of that. Okay. So, but this is particularly important in contextually sensitive situations, that there are other forms of legitimate and relevant knowledge. One contextually sensitive situation is Canadian First Nations or with other Indigenous peoples. Could be in the Congo, could be in Amazon, could be in a lot of different places, but because we're in Canada, I'm going to focus more on the Canadian situation. Okay, so what are the foundations then? What's the basis of this? This idea of a way of knowing, or this practice of knowing of things. So some of the base issues, and I want to start with the basics, okay? So is one of the basic issues is answering the question, what is knowledge? Okay, so we have to answer this, or ask the question, how do we know of things? So how do we construct our knowledge and apply that knowledge to formulate a perspective on reality, or what we think is reality? So how do we know of things? And these are fundamental. How do we know of things, and what do we use to know of things, and how do we perceive kind of existence of things? So what is a body of knowledge, for instance? These are fundamental questions, but they're philosophical questions. But I want to start with the base of this. Okay, so manipulate, consider themselves as part of the system passed down through generations. Okay. So first, what is a body of knowledge? So is anybody familiar with the term epistemology? Epistemology. This is a word that you need to know if you are going to work on these issues, right? So yes, good. So we're starting from a good place. So if you don't know what epistemology is, which some may not, particularly those that come from the natural sciences or the engineering world, it is based on the Greek. Here's the definition. Knowledge, root is episteme, for knowledge, understanding, or acquaintance. Now the word epistemology is not actually that old, really. So it's only been used kind of regularly for about a couple hundred years. And however, I mean, the question of epistemology and how do we go about understanding epistemology is as old as you know, thinking is. It's as old as philosophy is, really. Um, um, so an epistemology can be something held by a cultural group. Okay, so different groups or cultures may have different epistemologies. Their ways of understanding or possessing knowledge or utilizing knowledge, understanding things may differ or has characteristics, right? So any ecologists in the room or on the call? Anybody from ecology? So ecologists are the best, like in terms of this question, right? So you would think there'd see some uniformity in ecology, which to some degree there is. You know, generally speaking, you're looking at ecosystems, trying to understand them. But if you dig deeper into the discipline of ecological research, you will quickly find out that within ecology, there's a bunch of different epistemologies, the ways of knowing of nature, of ecosystems. So there's population ecology, community ecology, ecosystem ecology, all of which have different kind of underlying characteristics, tools, assumptions, predispositions that dictate the way that they go about knowing the world. So they have different epistemologies. Now, at the same time, though, um, the the general characteristics of all of them are founded on Western science. A hypothesis-driven understanding is one form of an epistemology, right? So environmental science, I guess, is one of the disciplines that is most prevalent in sustainable development. And it in itself is driven or supported by different disciplines: hydrology, ecology, atmospheric science, soils, geomorphology, and a few others. But traditionally, it has often defaulted to a Western view of knowledge, a scientific epistemology, if you will. Okay? So that way of knowing is kind of a foundational thing that we need to kind of recognize, especially if we're going to go forward and question that or say that that's not unto itself enough to answer some of the questions that we have today or address some of the issues that we have today. Okay, so the other big key term that I think is important when we start to ask this question about a way of knowing is ontology, right? So are you familiar with ontology? Those that know epistemology probably know about ontology as well. If not, here you go. Here's the definition. Okay. So ontology is the study of what there is. So what is something? Like how do we establish that there is something, the study of that? So some of the most basic questions in philosophy are ontological in nature, right? So one of the big ones is there a God? Does God exist? Right? The question of universal definition of something. You know, what is a dog? Right? How do you characterize what a dog is? And so that is the process of establishing what the definition of something is, or whether or not something exists at all. So when we deeply consider the challenge of different ways of knowing, we are embarking on basically an epistemological and ontological journey. And it's one that is often laced with cultural, historical, economic, and sociological dimensions. Just one sec.
What's good? What's up? Apple? Oh, you're eating my apple.
All right.
Ah!
That was my father. Oswald Sr.'s crashed out. So, Gaia, there we go. That's what I like to see. Yeah, Gaia is one idea, whether or not the Earth exists as a living entity. That's an ontological question. Does Gaia exist? The Gaia hypothesis is a hypothesis that is ontological in nature. Does everybody know about the Gaia hypothesis? Lovelock? Yes, everybody should. If not, look that up. Okay? So when we look at this ways of knowing, we are embarking on an epistemological and ontological journey, but it's often kind of nuanced or laced with cultural, historical, economic, and sociological dimensions. There's a lot of different things that will influence how we know of nature and society and how we established, David, no Gaia? Okay, here's some homework. Hypothesis. James Lovelock. That's must-know stuff. So it's sustainable development today. We're at a crossroads. Really, we are at a practical and a philosophical level. So the nature of science is being called into question to some degree. Post-normal science is becoming something that's quite popular, or people are discussing, have been more and more and writing about it. And science itself is being called into question as to its efficacy and ultimate domain over how we make decisions. Okay? So last week we mentioned Michel Foucault, right? And the work of Michel Foucault and others is influences this kind of discussion. Knowledge and science have often been used as a vehicle for domination and colonialization. We're going to look at examples of that, or at least sources of literature that document that I would recommend to you. Particularly in situations where there's a lot to gain and a lot to lose by certain groups. So as we in Canada start to consider decolonialization or reconciliation, we have to think about epistemology and ontology and how we go about agreeing upon ways of knowing, or either a way of knowing or multiple different ways of knowing. So now, in order to illustrate this or explore these ideas, rather than walk through a set of points and so forth, what I am going to do is to illustrate it through a series of what I consider to be seminal literature that I have enjoyed and benefited from over the past couple of years that highlight key points. Okay, and I will just I'm going to riff on each one. I have a key points from each one, but I'm just going to kind of open up a discussion on each one and get to hear what your thoughts are too. Okay, and they go in sequence. So I'm actually going to send through the links to them as well. Just one sec. I've got to open up a new window. One sec. Okay, the first book is this book, which has a misleading title. So I'm going to send this through. Okay, so this first book is by a woman named Mary Louise Pratt. And the title is Imperial Eyes, Travel Writing and Transculturation. So how do you think this plays into the whole idea of ways of knowing, considering the title? Travel writing and transculturation. basically this book is a historical account of some significant travel writing that has occurred over the past, I don't know, 1,000 years, or I guess maybe 500 years. How would that kind of topic inform what we're talking about? Travel writing. Say around the 1300s and 1400s, what was happening? Yes, loosely speaking, how someone sees the world, but specifically in like say 1400s, what was happening at that time? Yes, where? All over the place, right? The New World. Yes, exactly. So, but how was that New World articulated? How did people know of the New World? People from the Old World. How did people from the Old World know of the New World? Kind of, but what's formal gossip? Yes, getting closer. Accounts from travelers. Yes, travel writing. That's it. It was funny when I first picked up this book. I was thinking of Thoreau, who's a travel writer. Some of you may have read some of his books. Who's written like Riding the Iron Rooster and Happy Paddling Around Oceania, where he travels and does really kind of off the grid type of stuff and writes books about it. They're really interesting books. But this is different, because what Mary Louise Pratt, who I guess one could call her maybe an anthropologist or something like that, or a historian, I don't know, a mix of the two, I guess, probably more historian, talks about the role and the process by which two cultures come together and then one takes account of another. Okay? For instance, but the views of the traveler will always be from them. That's it. This is the point of that book. So those accounts of the travelers, and she goes in and studies, I've got the book here in my hand, there on my desk. She goes through, I would highly recommend reading this book, like when you get some time. She goes through different episodes of travel writing, or at least colonialization. Not even colonialization, it is colonialization, but where a culture has interacted with another culture and takes account of it, either through photography, mostly through writing, and then what implications that has. Okay? So for instance, she talks about a lot about the Spanish and European colonialists who went to South America and then wrote about it and then translated that kind of those stories to the old world. And that then kind of formulates what the old world is known of. So the other important point that I derive from this book is that it's a way of knowing that takes account of another culture, but that then, if that is a dominant way of knowing, which it was in this case, and which to some degree Western science is as well, that then becomes reality. That becomes history. That's the encoded history of how we understand the human experience, because that is what was encoded at the time and accepted, right? So then these stories of groups that are encountering indigenous peoples and different communities and so forth are their perceptions and their stories of what those realities are. Okay, and it's very interesting. And one of the key points that I would away from that is that there is this element that she has dubbed and she calls the contact zone. And this is the one thing that I'd like you to remember about this example is the idea of a contact zone. Now the contact zone in her eyes is that cultural space, or that kind of, conceptual space really, where one culture comes in contact with another culture, or a culture comes in contact with something. But it's the contact zone. It's where these kind of perceptions bang into each other. And what happens in that contact zone can influence a lot of different things. She articulates that and through various different case studies, that's how it did manifest itself. One of those was Charles Darwin's expeditions. And he, in essence, was a travel writer, right? He was a natural historian and travel writer, although he's also, the founder, I guess, of evolution theory. But that theory came about through travel writing, right? And then fed into this kind of, scientific body of knowledge that has then evolved since then. Okay? So the contact zone, this kind of space where cultures come in contact with one another, or a culture come in contact with something. And we have to understand the dynamics of contact zones to see the role of economics, to see the role of power, to see the role of interpretation, ethics, and so forth. We have to deal with this a lot today in research, because when you're going about doing a research project with a different culture, now that we know from experience, you have to thoroughly assess the potential risks of that, of what may occur in that process, particularly with respect to the contact zone, how the information is managed, and so forth. Okay. So she articulates this idea of the contact zone and then goes through and deconstructs various different examples of how history has been experienced and written through the perception, the dominant perception of one group over another. And the takeaway there is that we need to understand the contact zone and those dynamics, and that which writes history shapes history. The group that writes history can shape that history. Okay? So that's number one. Number two, this is a book like the Bible. Sure, that's a biggie. That's a biggie. Number two book with some takeaways is a bit heavier of a read. I don't know. It's good, but some interesting things. Not my. It's not. It's not. To me, it's not as impact. Didn't have as big of an impact as Pratt's work, but that's just me. So this book is entitled "The Intemperate Rainforest: Nature, Culture, and Power on Canada's West Coast." So this book here is a really interesting book from a more of a political and social standpoint, where it talks about, because he deeply explores this whole idea of representation of forests and how that plays a part in environmental politics. And he looks at specific eras or issues like Clayoquot Sound, for instance, and how the role of power and agency in representation of West Coast imagery. So, for instance, how indigeneity has been visualized in different circumstances, for better or for worse. Or I don't even say for better or for worse, because that's attaching judgment to it, but the impact of that, right? So what are some examples of visualization of indigeneity? What's an example of visualizing where you can see indigeneity? There we go. Classic one, totem poles. Right? What else? ceremonies for sure, art, cave art for sure. A lot of different ways in um, which indigeneity is visualized, homes, architecture, etc., etc. So what this book, I think the takeaway from this piece is looking at and being very critical. I don't mean like criticizing, like saying that's bad, but applying critical thinking of the politics, the social and cultural and political landscape behind different types of indigenous representations, particularly related to nature, and how they have been used for certain purposes. Okay, so for example, right, um, the uh, the visualization of pristine landscapes and indigenous presence in landscapes to represent pristine lands, right? In the West Coast. So, for instance, when you see an image and you see like indigenous canoe, da 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 da, and that is used, say, by environmental groups as representing this kind of undisturbed, pristine land that needs to be conserved. And what he does a really good job of is diving into some of these situations and looking at, and from a really critical perspective, looking at how different types of of these kind of visual representations of indigeneity have been used for purposes other than empowering indigenous peoples. Sometimes it has, sometimes it hasn't. But in the case of, say, environmental movement, some cases that's been co-opted as a means of promoting a conservation agenda. And at the same time, he looks at the role of indigenous art as a means of celebrating or recognizing indigenous history and culture. And he does a really good job of looking at an accounting of Emily Carr's work and the evolution of Emily Carr's work over her lifetime as an artist, and the importance of Emily Carr's work. So this is when we go further back up in this, we say art as a means of encoding cultural history and how important that is. And his kind of account of that and detailed critical analysis of that is really interesting. Um, so framing of nature as wild, but is it wild, right? Also coming to terms with looking at the ways in which the wild has been used by ecotourism, right? So ecotourist companies have often co-opted indigenous visual cues from indigenous cultures to represent wild, right? Go to the wild, escape modernity, and there's kind of utilization of in various types of indigenous visual cues in order to kind of show that. So this book, I think, is a really interesting piece to look at the critical underlying structures that are at work when we look at kind of representation of nature, culture, and the power dynamics that unfold when those different things come into contact with one another. And in this case, it's largely looking at rainforest, temperate rainforest issues, a lot of which I grew up with as growing up on the west coast of BC, Clayoquot Sound, Mears Island, and so forth and so on. So I found it interesting for that. Okay, so takeaway there, visualization of indigeneity as an important facet of ways of knowing. Okay, third one, boom, put that book down, bang. This is like book club tonight. Is a really great book and a really important one to read if you are at all interested in this stuff, and a fantastic read. Like this is one of, in my opinion, Okay, just a sec. Okay, I'm going to actually use the Nebraska. I'm going to use the. Here we go. I'm going to use the publisher's website as opposed to Amazon this time. Story's better. Here we go. This is a book by a gentleman by the name of Charles Menzies. He's a prof. He's an anthropologist at UBC. Anybody familiar with Peter Menzies? Or sorry, Charles Menzies. Okay. This is a book you should read. It's not a difficult read. It's extremely well written. It's like poetic almost. Like it is so extremely well written, this book. It's like it's fantastic. So Charles Menzies is Gitxaala. He's from northwest coast of British Columbia. And this book is called People of the Saltwater, an ethnography of Gitxaala. And this is a really interesting book, and there's some great takeaways here from this whole idea of ways of knowing by looking at an account of how the rules and structures that govern a society, so in this case the Gitxaala, and how those are intrinsically connected to place. Okay, so the key thing here is that when we need to think about, and when we're confronted with the fact that we need to perhaps even consider incorporating a different way of knowing when dealing with a group, whether it be local knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous knowledge, whatever it is, the idea of a sense of place is extremely important. Now, we got exposed to this with Tamashaw's work, but this takes that to a whole different level of practicality and application. And it's very well written. It's not a big book, and you can get through that real quick. And the key things that are important with this piece are the importance of a sense of place, the importance of place in the ethnography of a people. Excuse me. How many cultures self-identify is through their geography. So even us as individuals, to some degree identify with where we're from by the geography, right? So people that are from the island say, like, I'm an island person, right? People from the Kootenay say, I'm a Kootenay person, or whatever, like wherever you're from. People from Chicoutimi in Quebec say they're a bluet, like I'm a blueberry. But this idea that sense of place is extremely important and tied to the actual geography. Now, in the case of the Gitxaala, the way of knowing is tied to place, but it also features unique governance models and cultural practices that are also connected to place. So in this account here, it's not only just kind of how do you know about kind of the nature and natural resources and what's around you, but also how that knowledge then influences the rule sets that go into how that place is governed, right? So this whole issue that we started to see with the relationship or the difference between elected chiefs and hereditary chiefs and their role in decision making on a landscape is very evident in a book like this, because it talks about, at least for this one group, it's an ethnography of how their structure has worked for a very long time. So when looking at kind of encoding or utilizing a way of knowing and looking at a given situation, understanding that kind of relationship to a sense of place and how that impacts the cultural and social rule sets, practices, and that govern how they operate is an important thing to consider. So this is a great example of that. In their case, fisheries is especially important, and their version of natural resource management differs quite significantly from a Western science view. So Menzies is quite critical of tools that are quite commonly used in fisheries, and some of which that you will be looking at in the assignment, which is, you know, maximum sustainable yield or total the different type of yield calculations and figures that are used in modeling of fisheries and so forth. And they they don't believe in that. Like, that's not something that really makes sense to them. And he goes into that in that book. Okay, so Menzies. Two more. The next book covers a different dimension of this that's similar to things that we've looked at before already, which is the role of archaeology. Okay. How do we establish what has happened in the past? What's these, you know, what's the process? What is proof? What is valid? Right? And this is really important when it comes to things like establishing rights to land and so forth and so on. What is valid and what is considered to be invalid? So this book is a great piece. Again, another fantastic one by Susan Roy, and it's entitled "These Mysterious People: Shaping History and Archaeology in a Northwest Coast Community." So this book is a kind of a historical account of the role of archaeology in shaping history in northwest coast of British Columbia. So she goes in, and this is a fantastic book as well, because this will change your perspective on these things of looking at, like, for instance, who is first? Who are the original people of British Columbia? Right? Who are they? That's the question. Who do you think they are? What would you say? Who are the original people of British Columbia? Question mark. Anybody else? Getting there. Well, I'll go with that. So this is a question. How do you answer that question? How do you answer the question, who are the rightful people, the first peoples of British Columbia? Right? What would you need to do in order to establish that? You kind of need some evidence, I guess. Archaeology, exactly. So this book goes into great detail of accounting or deconstructing and analyzing the arguments that have played out over time based on the archaeological findings within northwest coast of BC, some of which, for those that are in Vancouver, are right here in Vancouver, along the Fraser River, where the Musqueam are. So the Marpole Midden. A midden is a large archaeological find, usually like a mound of shells and bones and so forth. And this book talks about accounts of what has happened through history of how archaeology has been used as a means, and science to some degree, well, no, not some degree, completely, as a means of establishing control. So I bring up the First Peoples argument because that was an argument used to refute First Nations peoples' claims as the original people of BC. They went to the archaeological record to claim that they had found remnants of a peoples that had predated the First Nations, what we know as First Nations today in BC. A group that had migrated to this area before them, and there was an archaeological record of this, that had a different kind of skeletal structure, and therefore the claim of being a first people of you know, say the Musqueam or Haida or whomever, was in refute as a result of that, right? So how that kind of, those dynamics play out from the archaeological record, and then in addition to that, and that's kind of establishing or encoding history, encoding what has happened through science, through looking through different kind of findings. But then in addition to that, she accounts for here the how documentation of the landscapes along the coast has been used as a means of kind of colonial control, right? So when you have people coming in and mapping the coast, mapping the geology and so forth. Also the utilization and capturing of indigenous um, icons, like so totem poles, for instance, and that whole kind of process by which the totem poles were purchased by people coming from museums from elsewhere. It's really interesting. Dehumanizing. Yeah, this book is eye-opening, I'm telling you. If you're from BC, you read this book, These Mysterious People, The Shaping and Archaeology Northwest. I'll read it. I mean, I got to read this again. It's really, really interesting. But the good thing is that this was kind of a breakthrough. This documents some breakthroughs in which those that are more enlightened folks later on, like the early archaeology that was done under the guise of a different mindset, a colonial mindset. Whereas, you know, this I would consider this an account of victory to some degree, or progress. This book, because they talk about, you know, now archaeological studies are largely done in partnership with you know, the local indigenous group or where you are. They are trained and they are empowered to be kind of stewards of the history of their place. That's more of the common practice now, and they document that in this book and how those changes came about, which is great. So this book examines archaeology and the uncovering indigenous sites as a means of understanding shared history, settler and non-settler history. For example, who came first? So how does that then legitimize what land rights are valid or not? There's also a few through our eyes and cultural beliefs. Correct. Ethnographic studies and the gathering of artifacts as an avenue for, in some cases, cultural domination. So the Marpole Midden is an example in this book of an actual physical site or mound of archaeological materials, bones, artifacts, shells, that was just kind of loaded with these kind of cue points or signals into the history. So one common theme, though, is one defining part here is dispossession remains one of the defining parts of Aboriginal and settler history, as reflected in this book. And the other thing is, what comes out a lot in this book is what constitutes evidence. And this is an important thing for us in this discussion, is to say, well, what constitutes legitimacy when we're doing this kind of work in a way of knowing standpoint. So for instance, do archaeological findings, are they the ultimate kind of source of evidence in a given situation, right? What other types of evidence might we look at? This is a question to you. What's another thing you might look to when you're looking at assessing the natural history of a place, right? Say if you're doing an environmental assessment and you had to go in a new culture, historical accounts from First Nations, sure, yes, but what in what format? Usually they're not written, often not. Yes, interview and take it to the next level. Local knowledge, yes, not books as much, unfortunately. How is that knowledge stored and transmitted? There we go, that's what I'm looking for. Verbal stories or oral histories. Legends as well, you know, that's another way. Myths, cosmologies, what have you. But oral history is the term that's used a lot in kind of representing that. And in fact, you know, oral history is now being accepted legally in certain cases. I can send you the links to those cases. Okay, so this book here, These Mysterious People, are really kind of seminal work in looking at the key things about how do you define what is legitimate. and how has that occurred over time? So these are related, these ideas, right? So the archaeological record is formulated by someone else, right? And they were in that contact zone. So you see how Pratt's work kind of relates to this? And you need to think about those things when you're analyzing these situations. If you're jumping into a situation fresh, you want to have an idea about the history. Okay, last book is a biggie. This isn't light reading, this last one. It's all, everybody's cheering outside. Just one sec. There we go. Okay, this book here is another landmark piece of work that might want to find its way to bookshelf. Written by a couple, Marianne Ignacy and Ronald Ignacy from, I think, SFU. But this is like almost an almanac. It's a big book. Like I've got it here. It is like 2 inches thick. And this is from the Similkameen area, so the kind of Caribou interior of BC. And this is a complete account of one of the most complete account of those peoples, kind of the big middle area of BC, I would say. And what it's really kind of special for is contrary to what I just said about there not being many written accounts of this of First Nations history. This remedies that. This captures a complete and comprehensive documentation by they are First Nations of that culture, and it talks about the big takeaways from this one are, well, an account of a historical account of what has happened there, but also kind of an account of the art, the artifacts, and how they see the world. So what are the narratives and stories that constitute and are the foundation to their worldview? So for instance, how does mythology intersect with history and our present reality? What is the role of storytelling in this kind of different culture, which is profound? You know, it's you know, really, really important, obviously, if you read this book, to understand these kind of like the stories of the trickster and so forth, and how that dictates how people see the world, this group. But this is really special from just like, from an achievement standpoint. It is it's like an almanac of this culture. It's very comprehensive, as opposed to other groups that, you know, haven't had the opportunity to have their history captured and told in a way that truly represents their views. And this is, you know, a very good example of people representing their history in their way, in their language, with their views. Okay? All right. And this seminal work is one of the most comprehensive accounts of an Indigenous culture, certainly in the interior of BC. And it's an archaeological and cultural almanac of the peoples that were here some 2,000 years before the present. This is how far it goes back, the account of what has happened in that part of BC. Okay? So, historical account. So ways of knowing, like what I've kind of tried to like touch on with these different examples of scholarship that's been done, is that there's some really important aspects of a way of knowing that we need to consider when we are faced with using one or understanding a different way of knowing. Okay? So, to conclude then, or to kind of like put this back into practice, the question is, how might this apply in the present day? And does it apply? What do you think? Do these things apply in the present day? Yes or no? Yes. How though? I think so. Okay. In what situation might these apply? Where would you have to pull on this stuff if you're, thrown into a situation right now? Different ways of understanding. Better constant picture of you. Sometimes, right? That's better. Sure, sure. But I want you to be practical. What is a situation where you might have to use this today in work? Management plans, sure, yes. To preserve land, yes. Sure, what else? Development, yes. Natural resource development. Reconciliation, yes. Areas with knowledge gaps and research, sure, yeah. Natural resource development or development in general, environmental impact assessments, right? David and others who might be from 415, EIAs, ways of knowing, really important now, right? At least that's what we're being told by the federal government. So pulling on that, and I want to give you a TEK. Yeah, utilization of TEK is embodying or utilizing a way of knowing. So TEK is not blanket. Like TEK from here, or even within BC, TEK can be totally different from like down with the Musqueam up in the Haida. Like it'd be different, right? Presumably influenced by some of these things that we've just discussed, right? Cultural history, maybe influenced over time by different kind of dominant forces in the contact zone, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to draw on these kind of characteristics or issues or I guess principles that we can pull from these different pieces of literature in order to properly try and address those issues. So I want to give you an example of how that is documented in a good article written by Maria Tengo. She's from Sweden. She's pretty cool. So I'm happy to share her work, which talks about this here. And it's just, I believe this is open source, so I think you can download that article. Now this started, and now this is kind of blowing up macro to the international level. This idea of like looking, okay, well, does Western science alone answer the questions that we need to answer when we look at environmental assessments and sustainable development? And the answer is it hasn't. It's not completely failed us. In fact, it's been done tremendous things for us, but it doesn't do everything, right? And it started with, I believe I mentioned the Millennium Assessment, which was published in 2005. So that's a while ago now. It's not, so this isn't a new thing. But we've kind of had some practice with this over time. And this paper, written by Maria and colleagues, yes, you can download it. Yeah, you can. So it's open source. Amazing. Talks about weaving knowledge systems into IPBES, CBD, and beyond, lessons learned for sustainability. So they talk about their experience and their lessons they have learned with analyzing and looking at the role of different knowledge systems in international reporting processes to the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystems, which is, IPBES is the equivalent of the IPCC. It's the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, but for biodiversity and ecosystems. So they looked at how different knowledge systems have been used or attempted to have been used in documenting the status of biodiversity and ecosystems globally to have that kind of picture, much like we have for IPCC, for climate, for biodiversity. They've also looked at it from more of a national standpoint in reporting to the Convention for Biological Diversity, the CBD. So it's a really neat article that kind of looks at the role of different institutions and processes from a practical standpoint of how these kind of knowledge systems can be used together. And so they've outlined 5 tasks to enable the bridging of knowledge. One is to mobilize to develop knowledge-based products outcomes through a process of innovation or engaging with past knowledge and experience. So engaging with past knowledge is getting in touch with the history of a place. They have outlined translate, so means to adapt knowledge, products, or outcomes into forms appropriate to enable mutual comprehension. So this is really important. I've seen this in EIAs before where the EIA isn't translated into a language that the local indigenous stakeholder can understand, right? And correspondingly, the local knowledge hasn't been translated or communicated in a way that the development group or the EIA practitioner can understand. So translation's a really important part of that process as well. Negotiate means to interact among different knowledge systems to develop mutually respectful and useful representations of knowledge. This is really important. How do we kind of find that balance and mutual respect for the assets that natural Western science has brought us, as well as the importance of local knowledge or different other types of knowledge systems that might be relevant to a different context. Okay. Synthesize means to shape broadly accepted common knowledge bases for a particular purpose. So how do we put these different knowledge systems together for a specific purpose? In the case of this, in this task here, it's been to report to the CBD. And then lastly, to apply means to use common knowledge bases to make decisions and take actions and to reinforce and feedback into knowledge systems. So apply that synthesized knowledge into the actual kind of reporting process. In the case of the CBD, they talk about, say, reporting for NBSAPs, as National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plans. That's something you need to produce for as a country. So how do you synthesize that knowledge into something like an NBSAP or a National Biodiversity Report? So great article, and really I think it's a modern, and I think, what's the year this? I think it's 2017, I believe. I think, just can't remember. Yeah, 2017. So pretty new, and deals with the things right now. IPBES, CBD for biodiversity and ecosystems. Very relevant to, global biosphere. All right, so that's kind of what I had to prepare for this evening. Hopefully that there's a few elements in there that you're able to kind of draw on and will inform your practice. What I will do is I will put a PDF of the notes and the links that I have talked about on the Moodle, or I'll put it on the YouTube or whatever. I'll make sure you can get it. And same with last week, so I haven't done that yet. So you have those references. I'm still kind of getting a handle on all this like podcast stuff. All right, does anybody have any questions? Do you think these are things that can be used in what you're working on right now in your case study? I hope so. That was the idea. It'd be nice to see some of these links. The last one for sure. Yeah, the last one for sure. I think also, I think Menzies might be interesting. Look at Menzies stuff, particularly Menzies, and I think Menzies and Wa. Like these mysterious people in Menzies' book would be interesting for, like, say, for instance, if you're in the Indigenous group, then you want something to base kind of your position on, and this is not that far away. Like they're northwest coast of BC, Alaska area. There's similar characteristics up there, biophysically and so forth. The other ones, you know, you can just read in your spare time. Okie dokie. Good. So, thank you for coming out. This is recorded and it will be shared for others. And feel free to share it with other people if you want. It's all free and accessible by anybody who has access to YouTube. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to Imperial Eyes. Imperial Eyes, okay, like if you want to read any of these books, if there's one you should read, that is the one. Like in terms of wow factor. I mean, they're all good. I'm not trying to play favorites here, but for me personally, the one that had the most impact was that one. And I guess I should admit that I've traveled a lot in Central America, and in my 20s I was in Nicaragua and so forth, and El Salvador, and I lived that. Like I lived going to rainforests with indigenous peoples, and you know, so when I read that book, I come, oh my God, like it changed the way I looked at my experience then, right? Like I really, wow, yeah, that's a biggie. If you've been to Latin America, traveled at all, like Guatemala particularly, then that book, you read that book, it's going to change. You'll look back on what you experienced, you go, oh, whoa, I didn't realize what was going on, you know, or what, especially what went on, and then, you know, what goes on when you go in those environments, because there's dynamics that are at play. She does a fantastic, that's a famous book. She's Canadian, and it's just like, it's like a huge, important book now in kind of sociology or anthropology, more anthropology, I guess. Okie dokie. Thank you, and we will see you online.